Welcome back to Foundations in Psychology. I'm Dr. Ryan Langridge. This is our third and final video in our lecture series focusing on the neuron. In our first video, we talked about the structure of the neuron and gave a brief introduction to the nervous system. In our second video, we talked about the action potential and what happens when a neuron reaches its threshold of excitation, fires that action potential, positive charge runs down the length of the axon, eventually reaching the axon terminals. And in this, our third video, we're going to talk about the synapse, the actual communication that occurs as a result of that action potential, and how one neuron communicates with another and possibly many other neurons within a network in the brain. So here what we have pictured is the synapse. And here the synapse includes the axon terminal of what we would call the presynaptic neuron, and the dendrite of what we call the postsynaptic neuron, as well as a brief little space in between that we refer to as the synaptic cleft. So the neuron that is passing information that is just fired an action potential and will now release chemicals called neurotransmitters is called the presynaptic neuron, and the dendrite of the neuron, so that's listening, that's going to receive that message, we call the postsynaptic cell or the postsynaptic neuron. So action potential is fired, positive charge runs down the length of the axon, reaches the axon terminals, at which point the vesicles are opened up and neurotransmitters are released into the synapse. And eventually they're going to find and bind to what we call the receptor of the postsynaptic cell. So these neurons are eventually going to find a specific receptor on the postsynaptic cell's dendrites. And once it binds with that receptor, it's going to either increase the charge of that dendrite, if it's an excitatory neurotransmitter, or it will decrease the charge of that dendrite if it's an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So remember, we spoke in the previous videos that if a neurotransmitter is excitatory, it's going to increase the positive charge of the neuron, bring it closer to that threshold of excitation, and make it more likely that that neuron is going to fire its own action potential. If the neurotransmitter being released from this presynaptic neuron is inhibitory, then when it binds to the receptor of this postsynaptic neuron, it's going to decrease the charge of that cell and make it harder for that neuron to reach its threshold of excitation, and therefore it will be less likely to fire an action potential, less likely to go on and pass its own message on to other neurons. So once a neuron binds with the receptor of the dendrite of the postsynaptic cell, it's released back into the synapse. And you may be asking, okay, what happens then? Does it just continue to float around, occasionally bind to the receptors on the postsynaptic cell? And yes, this is the case, it will do this, but not forever. In some cases, what will happen is metabolic enzymes will come through the synapse and just end up breaking up these neurotransmitters so that they just kind of come through and clean them up so that they're no longer bouncing around the synapse, no longer do they have the opportunity to pass information on to the postsynaptic neuron. In other cases, however, these neurotransmitters may actually be reabsorbed into that presynaptic cell by a process called reuptake. So sometimes these neurons, via this process of reuptake, get reabsorbed back up into this cell and removed from the synapse. The end result of both of these processes is that neurotransmitters that at one point were in the synapse passing on their message to the postsynaptic dendrite are now no longer in the synapse, and so they're not passing on this message. And this is important because it means that when an action potential is fired, neurotransmitters are released and that message is then sent on to other neurons, but that doesn't continue forever. You need that neuron to be sent for, or that message to be sent for a little bit, but then to stop when is appropriate. When a specific type of neurotransmitter is released into the synapse, it binds to a very specific receptor. So this is sometimes referred to as a lock and key method. Each neurotransmitter is a specific key, and it needs to find its own specific receptor or lock to bind to and to pass on that message. In fact, one of the ways to tell whether a specific neurotransmitter is prevalent in a particular part of the brain or whether a specific neurotransmitter is really important for a specific process in one brain area compared to another is to look at what types of neurotransmitter receptors you see in that area. And if you see a lot of receptors for a particular type of neurotransmitter, that suggests that there's going to be a lot of neurotransmitters going to that area, because we know that a specific neurotransmitter will find and bind to a specific receptor. So while you certainly don't need to know all of the neurotransmitters within the nervous system, there are a few worth mentioning, and probably some that you've already heard of before. Dopamine, for example, very important in motivation and drive and our pleasure and reward system. Serotonin you've probably also heard of before as well. It's involved in mood regulation and sleep quality and appetite to some extent. You may not have heard of glutamate or GABA, but glutamate we would call the primary excitatory neurotransmitter in the nervous system. So as we mentioned, we have excitatory neurotransmitters, which increase the charge of the postsynaptic neurons, and glutamate is one of these primary excitatory neurotransmitters. It's a very prevalent one within the nervous system, and it's really involved in speeding up a lot of processes or a lot of functions in the brain and body. Alternatively, we have GABA, which is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the nervous system. So its primary function is to inhibit the postsynaptic cell, and it decreases the charge, making it harder for that neuron that's receiving the message to fire an action potential. So GABA is really involved in slowing processes down and inhibiting certain networks or certain behaviors. Some lesser known but certainly still important neurotransmitters are acetylcholine, which is involved in attention and the execution of movement, as well as norepinephrine, which is involved in a whole host of different behaviors, including our mood, our memory, our focusing of attention, so on and so forth. I think it might be helpful at this point to kind of zoom out and, considering all that we've learned about in the past 3 videos, really get a good understanding of what's happening here and how these neurons are communicating with each other. Once a neuron's dendrites receives enough positive charge that it reaches its threshold of excitation, it will fire an action potential, which will make its way down the length of the axon and eventually reach the axon terminals. At this point, neurotransmitters will be released from the vesicles. They'll float around in the synaptic cleft, eventually bind to the appropriate receptor on the postsynaptic dendrite, and pass on whatever specific message that neurotransmitter is passing on, whether it be inhibitory, excitatory, whether it be related to this specific function or another function. They'll then bounce back up and either get cleaned up or reabsorbed. But the message that that neurotransmitter passes on to the postsynaptic dendrite is either going to increase the likelihood that that postsynaptic neuron will fire or decrease the likelihood that that postsynaptic neuron will fire. So what we have here is the presynaptic neuron passing a message on to the postsynaptic neuron. And any specific neuron is going to be receiving these types of messages from any number of neurons at any given time. And that's how the charge increases or decreases appropriately. So let's take this network of neurons as we've shown here. So this neuron on the right, let's say, passes on excitatory information to this postsynaptic neuron. It's also receiving excitatory information from this neuron here, and all this excitatory information means the positive charge ramps up, the threshold of excitation is reached, this neuron becomes so positively charged that it passes its own action potential down and then passes its information on to this, the now postsynaptic neuron. This message is either going to be excitatory or inhibitory. Either way, it's going to influence the rate at which this neuron passes on an action potential towards this neuron. And at a certain point, that threshold of excitation will be reached. Action potential will be fired, neurotransmitters will be released, passed on to now this neuron here, and so on and so forth. And what you can see is this large number of neurons are now communicating with each other back and forth. And this is what we mean when we say a network of neurons communicating with each other. And as mentioned at the beginning of this lecture series, it's this communication between large networks of neurons that allow us to think the way we think, behave the way we do, interact with other people, plan for the future, and any of these behaviors that we say make us human. Okay, and there you have it. So through these 3 videos, we've talked about the structure of the neuron, how neurons are distributed throughout the brain and body, how an action potential is fired, and now in this 3rd video, how an action potential releases neurotransmitters from the axon terminals and how those neurotransmitters go on to communicate with other neurons and pass on a specific message that will alter the activity of the postsynaptic neuron. If you learned something from these videos and you'd like to see more of them, please like and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions about anything that we've covered so far, or if you're more interested in the higher level behaviors like thought, memory, attention, that we now understand as being products of the types of neuronal interactions we've spoken about, please feel free to leave us a comment.